Howdy historians, how's it going? Welcome to China Part 3. Last time we were together, we were talking about the Ming Dynasty amongst others and how China is growing and developing. We're starting to see a complex relationship between China and foreign influence. Some Chinese dynasties are okay with foreign influence, others are not. In the Ming Dynasty, we saw a lot of trade and a lot of expansion of trade and its influence. Some people in China were okay with that, others thought it was bad and that it was going to hurt them in the long run. And today what we're going to see is how some of that foreign influence does start to become a problem for our last dynasty, the Qing Dynasty. So if you've got your lecture outline out, you can see the Qing Dynasty right here. Today we're going to talk about is the First and Second Opium War. And then in China Part 4, we'll start to look at the Boxer Rebellion, and then we'll take a look at the Republic of China and the communist takeover of China later on. Okay, so that's where we are today. Qing Dynasty, First and Second Opium War are the main objectives for the day. Now, First and Second Opium Wars happening during the Qing Dynasty. You can see the years for the Qing Dynasty here, 1644 to 1911. We'll see both the First and Second Opium Wars today. 1839 and 1856 will be the starting years for our First and Second Opium War. And to do this, we're going to get kind of like a guest speaker. We're going to watch a YouTube video from a different historian, so that way you don't have to listen to me all the time. He also has some really cool, like, cute little animations to go along with his videos, and he's got a good British accent, which is always fantastic. So here are your guiding questions. For the First Opium War, the three things I want you to think about. What are the two main causes of the war? Why did the English win? What are the parts, the provisions for the Treaty of Nanking? Okay, so those are the three things you're looking for. Now, for this video here on the First Opium War, I'll admit the guy speaks rather quickly, but don't worry about it. You can pause it, right? That's the great thing about a video. So pause it, slow it down if you have to, and then focus on those three questions that I gave you. There's going to be a lot of stuff in here that you don't necessarily need to write down. All right, so focus on, again, what are the two causes of the war? Why did the English win? What's going on in the Treaty of Nanking? Okay, so it's a nice short little video. Here we go. Take some notes as you go.
Some chap has just ordered the destruction of some opium. Lim Seshu was the name of this man, a Chinese official who'd confiscated the opium from a man called Charles Elliot. The British had been making a lot of money selling it to the Chinese because opium is incredibly addictive. The Chinese government had banned its import and sale because it was ruining the country, but that didn't stop the British because money. Seshu had hoped that this open display of defiance would deter the British from continuing to sell opium to China. He was wrong. As a result, Elliot, who oversaw all British trade with China, ordered the withdrawal of all British men and ships from Canton and out of the country. The British were furious that the Chinese thought that they were allowed to tell them what to do in China, and so they mobilised the Royal Navy for war. Seshu wasn't concerned about war since he felt that the British would only win at sea, but on land the Chinese were safe. The British fleet arrived at the island of Zhoushan here in 1840 and demanded that it surrender. The inhabitants said no and dug in for a long siege. On July the 5th at 2:30 the Royal Navy began its bombardment, and by 2:39 the bombardment was over and the island's defences were completely destroyed. The British then took the island with no further resistance. The First Opium War had begun in earnest. The Chinese, led by the Daoguang Emperor of the Qing dynasty, didn't take the war or the British very seriously at first. A part of this came from the entrenched Chinese belief that all foreigners were barbarians who were destined to live under the rule of the Emperor. This is demonstrated by the fact that during the war they referred to the British not as foreigners but as rebels. The British, under the leadership of Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston, expected the war to be a difficult one. It was about two things. The first was obviously the right to continue selling opium to the Chinese. The second was to end the idea of Chinese superiority and to be seen by the imperial court as equals in all things. Anywho, while sailing up the Chinese coast, the Royal Navy had attempted to deliver a letter of their peace terms to the Emperor. The Emperor largely ignored these demands and instead decided that Britain would be happy if Lin Seshu was removed. He had him replaced with a man called Qi Shan, who met Elliot in late 1840 to discuss terms. Qi Shan promised that a peaceful solution could be found and told the Brits to simply wait until the Emperor deigned to reply to them. Months passed and the British were unhappy to wait anymore, and so in early 1841, back to fighting. The British were victorious at the Battle of Chunpi, and Qi Shan and Elliot met to discuss terms in late January. Elliot demanded Hong Kong, the reopening of the opium trade in Canton, a bunch of cash, and for the British to be recognised as equals. The Emperor said no and had Qi Shan arrested and replaced him with two men, the Emperor's cousin Yi Shan and a general called Yang Fang. Their task was simple: crush the British entirely. The intensity of fighting picked up soon after this, and by March the British were sitting outside of Canton. Yang Fang agreed agreed to allow the British to trade there again in return for the soldiers leaving, which they did. The emperor was furious and removed Yang Fang and demanded that Yishan now destroy the British, because that's how that worked. Canton was reinforced while the British took defensive positions around the city. Yishan attacked the British on the 21st of May. He was repelled, and about a week later the city was captured by the British and looted. During this battle, the Qing forces outnumbered the British about 50,000 to 6,000. So why did the British win? The two main reasons were technology and training. Whilst China had been the birthplace of gunpowder, most Qing soldiers were equipped with spears or bows, and those that had guns had old matchlock muskets. Whereas the British had much newer weaponry, and their soldiers were also very well trained and were often veterans of other conflicts, unlike the Qing, who were mostly peasant conscripts who sometimes fought bandits. This discrepancy was much larger at sea, where British warships were of much better quality than the Chinese ships called junks that they faced. The British had also brought with them a brand new warship, the HMS Nemesis, which was an iron-hulled, steam-powered warship which outclassed anything the Qing could throw at them. The pattern of a much larger Qing force being defeated by a small yet technologically superior British force continued throughout the rest of the war. Over the next year, the British captured many coastal cities and forts. In mid-1842, the British captured Qingqiang, which meant that they could blockade the Yangtze River and China's Grand Canal, which meant that food couldn't be shipped across the empire. The emperor thus decided to sue for peace with Britain, and they both signed the Treaty of Nanking. The terms were that trade would now go through these cities as well as Canton, and that this trade would include opium. That China would pay Britain what is technically known as a boatload of money, and that Hong Kong would be ceded to Britain as well. In return, the Chinese got sweet nothing, and this treaty is referred to as the First Unequal Treaty. For China, the Treaty of Nanking marks the beginning of a period known as the Century of Humiliation, in which China would suffer internal rebellions and degrading foreign interventions, one of which was the Second Opium War, but that's for another video. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for watching. A special thanks to...
Okay, so that's the First Opium War. We can see the answers to our questions there. We can see that foreign influence is starting to be a problem, and it's going to lead to this century of dishonor. So now we get into the Second Opium War. Here are your questions. What are the four main causes? Why did the French help the English? And then at the very end, what's the big idea? What does the war show historians? So again, I know this dude talks fast because he's trying to get it in quick, but just pause it. There's lots of good stuff going on here, and such cute little animations that he has, which I just love because I'm a history dork. So here we go. Opium War Part 2. You know your three big ideas. Causes. Why did the French get involved? What's the big idea? Why do we care?
And Britain is unhappy with China. The reason for this was that China, having recently been defeated in the previous Opium War, was supposed to give concessions to Britain, which it had yet to do. Another issue was that British consumption of tea was so great that Britain was operating a huge trade deficit with China. The only thing salvaging British finances was the continued sale of opium into China from British India. Another problem was that China was currently dealing with the Taiping Rebellion, whose leaders kept destroying opium wherever they found it. The sale of opium into China was vital for balancing Britain's finances, and so it had to keep flowing. In late 1856, the governor of Canton, Yi Ming-chen, impounded a Chinese-operated ship that he believed was committing piracy, or at least was working on behalf of the rebels. One problem though, the ship was registered in Hong Kong, now a British territory, and as a result the British were furious. Frankly, the British consul to China, Harry Parkes, was itching for another war there because he wanted to make a name for himself. Yi offered to give the sailors back, but Britain said no and sailed the Royal Navy up the Pearl River and shelled Canton. Back in Britain, Parliament was fiercely against any war with China, but the Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, was very much for it. Parliament voted against any further action, mostly because of the outbreak of a major mutiny in India in 1857. As a result, Palmerston called an election, and after denouncing the Chinese as barbarians to the British people, he won, and so war it was. An alliance was built with the French because they also wanted to trade with China, but the Americans, after taking a fort in late 1856, declared their neutrality, and Russia wanted nothing to do with it because they were still recovering from the Crimean War. So the war in China, the Second Opium War, followed a similar path to the first. The Royal Navy used their ironclad steam-powered warships to obliterate the Chinese wooden ships called junks wherever they met. In late 1857, Anglo-French forces captured Canton and captured Yi, who was then imprisoned in India. After this, the British and French navies made their way up the coast of China, harassing the defenders and smashing forts as they went. The Chinese emperor, the Xianfeng emperor of the Qing dynasty, soon after opted to sue for peace. The negotiations resulted in the Treaty of Tianjin, which gave France, Russia, the US and Britain the right to trade and for their citizens to freely travel throughout China. The US and Russia were were allowed to get in on the action despite not fighting because it meant that if China backed down on their agreements it would risk retaliation from all four powers. Plus, Russia had just negotiated the transfer of this territory. The Qing didn't want another front to fight on. One problem: when negotiators went to Beijing to ratify this truce in 1859, they were kidnapped and tortured by the Chinese government. This, for the British, was proof that their opinion of the Chinese as being little more than barbarians was justified. The commander of the British forces in China, the Earl of Elgin, was actually against the war, but after the capture of the negotiators he felt that he had to retaliate to protect Britain's honour. The British and French then landed their forces in the north and captured many forts on their way to Beijing. They soon clashed with a large Qing army at the Battle of Palikao. This saw over 1,000 Chinese casualties compared to about 50 on the Anglo-French side. The Chinese had now lost the will to pursue the war, mostly because of, again, the ongoing Taiping Rebellion. After the battle, the emperor fled Beijing, leaving his brother Prince Gong to negotiate with the Europeans. Anglo-French forces then moved on Beijing, which opened its gates to them, after which the most famous event of the war happened. The Allied soldiers forced their way into and looted the emperor's summer palace, and when Elgin found out the Chinese had killed many of the envoys, he ordered it burned to the ground. The Chinese then signed the 1860 Treaty of Beijing, which did several things. It confirmed the 1858 treaty, increased the reparations that China would pay, gave Russia more territory, and also saw Britain gain slightly more land around Hong Kong. Interestingly, this war is called the Second Opium War, but opium's role was largely secondary. This time it was about enforcing open trade and demonstrating to China that Europeans were now the dominant ones in the region. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching, and a special thanks to all of these patrons you see on screen for the
Alright, so there are the First and Second Opium Wars. Absolutely crazy. England as a country is just basically a giant drug dealer forcing their product on China. Now, one thing I realized too is I was just kind of watching this with you. Some of you might be asking, what is opium? Alright, he mentions it just a little bit in the first video. It's addictive. Opium's a drug. Okay, or opium comes from the same plant that like heroin comes from. It's highly addictive. At this time, the English were making it and selling it to the Chinese, and the Chinese were smoking it. A lot of times they would like hallucinate as they took it, and there were lots of problems to go along with that. So something that's been around for a long time, and something that the English are making a lot of money off of. So they just want to keep it going because they talked a little bit in there about a trade deficit. The English needed this. This was a money maker for the English to sell opium to the Chinese, so they pushed it on them. But for the Qing dynasty, this is showing that they're starting to have major problems with foreign powers and foreign influence on their empire and on their people, and it's going to eventually cause the fall of all dynasties. The Qing dynasty is going to end so badly it will lead to the modern era of Chinese history, the Republic of China, and then eventually the communist takeover. But there's a few other things that need to happen first. So that's what we'll come back and talk about next time we look at the Boxer Rebellion and some other problems that are going on in China that lead to the end of dynasties, and again, the start of that modern era. So you've got just a really quick little check quiz to make sure that this stuff made sense for you and that you got it done. Hop over to the assignment section, finish that up, and then when we come together next time, we'll talk about the Boxer Rebellion, the end of dynasties, and the start of the Chinese Republic. Have a great one. Miss you guys. Hope all is well. See you soon. Bye-bye.